Herzlich willkommen zum 38. DocFest München, and I will switch to English right away. A warm welcome to the 38th edition of DocFest Munich, 130 films coming from 55 countries. My name is Pablo Bücheler, and I'm part of the programming team of the festival. And I'm very happy to welcome in our Doc studio at the Silbersaal of Deutsches Theater München, Yong Bang Carlson, the director of Dreaming Arizona. Welcome, Yong Bang Carlson.
Thank you.
Your film is a production from Denmark, Estonia, Norway from the year 2022, and it runs in our festival section, Best of Fests. First of all, I also want to welcome, before we dive into our talk, I will also welcome our listeners at our new podcast channel. So that's done as well. So as I mentioned, the production countries is Denmark, Estonia, Norway, very Scandinavian countries. And considering the production countries, you could think of Scandinavian words or so. But no, in your film, you lead us right in the middle of the Arizonan desert, a small town called Winslow. We follow a group of teenagers of the local high school rehearsing for their play, a theater play. And then suddenly reality, myths, dreams seem to blur and a fascinating story develops. Maybe for all our listeners and viewers that have not seen the film, could you give us a little insight, a little summary of the film? How would you describe this little microcosmos of Winslow, Arizona?
Well, first of all, I've always had a kind of a love affair with shooting very kind of distant places in America. I've done a lot of films in America, but never in like the big metropolises, always out there, what they call one-horse places, very on the remnants in the periphery of life. That's where I get ignited, my little filmic ego gets ignited. And the good thing about working in America is that we're all strangers in America. And to a certain degree, when I'm in Denmark, I feel like a stranger in Denmark, but I know Denmark so well. I've been here for generations, and somehow it blocks my vision that I'm so at home in Denmark. I feel more open to telling about life when I'm in America. And this story is a story about, in the beginning I said it's a story about freedom. It's a story about dare we use the freedom, in America, freedom also is a very big thing, They even arm themselves to defend freedom, against the state and stuff like that. We don't really do in Europe, right? But this film is I wanted to do a story about whether we actually can use that freedom, if we dare to use that freedom. And then I got the idea that I would like to use the teenagers, which I think that teenagers are maybe the zenith of human existence. We never get more intelligent than when we are like 13, 14, 15, 16, in the very beginning of our mature. We are kind of open to the very big questions in life, the big philosophical issues, and we're very sensitive. Life gets very close to our skin. We're not hiding behind this kind of cloak of maturity that we hide behind later in life, all those intellectuals bullshit that we, to a certain degree, learn and always can put a piece of intellectual bullshit between us and the sensitivity of life. So I decided to make teenagers my main characters in this film. And then it's very important for me that landscapes are important to me, that I can somehow use landscapes in the storyline. And suddenly I remember that way back in 1985, I did a film called Phoenix Bird about some right-wing guys in Phoenix that put up a survival school. And the last scene in that film, they have a scenario where they say, okay, now there's an atomic bomb scenario, and we have to hide away from civilization. And they actually go up to this very part, that landscape, the very last shot in the in the film, when you see the bus going to the kind of the Navajo reservation, you see kind of a coin framed mountain. That's where those white guys go up to get out of the civilization and see. So I decided, I always wanted to go back to that landscape and use that landscape. So I went up there again, and I, suddenly bumped into a local high school and this drama club, and then I thought that could be a very nice way to start, my documentary film in a drama club. Some students are going to put up the new school play, and they choose not to do some famous Shakespearean thing. This time they choose to write the story themselves. And of course, in that process, we learn all the feelings of our protagonists, get to know them for the camera, and slowly the fiction that develops, fiction in the way that in order to understand yourself, you have to turn yourself into a story. What I say in the very beginning, I say that for me, documentaries and dreams have always been two sides of the same coin. You cannot, there's nothing which is only documentary. If you take away the dream, it becomes,
Let's talk about your take of reality, because I think it's important to know for someone interested in this film, this is not at all like what we are used to see when we see a documentary. It's I get some, I don't know, David Lynch vibes. I get these spooky Americana vibes when I see your film. What is your take of reality? You were already beginning to explain to us, but how do you mix up these documentary scenes and this kind of fiction that begins to develop?
Yeah, well, of course, in this setup, it becomes more or less organic, because those guys, they're in their documentary selves. They go up on a stage and they open up to each other in order to get material for the play. And I start to write to make this stage bigger than the little stage you are at the high school. It kind of becomes their whole environment, becomes one big stage, like in the final Shakespeare quotation, the world's one big stage, we're all actors in it, right? But my beginning, from the very, I'm an old guy. I came out of film school in '76, and the first time I was going to everybody wanted to make fiction films, and I wanted to, but the only thing I wasn't never very attracted to those film studios, and I actually was not very attracted to, at that time, professional actors and all which I at that time saw as some kind of mannerism, I was much more attracted to the real world out there, those real people. And also I wanted to tell stories that didn't necessarily have that kind of dramatic kind of drive that actors need to survive up on the screen. In order for a professional actor to become believable on the screen, he has to be weaved into a dramatic drive. Otherwise we'll see, this is not a farmer. This is some intellectual guy from Kreuzberg who pretends to be a farmer. He learned it very well. But if you look at his skin, he's not right. He spent too much time drinking cafe au lait and talking to other intellectuals in Berlin, right? He's not a real farmer, right? I needed the real farmer, because if you use the real farmer who has total authenticity, you actually don't need that dramatic superstructure. You can actually tell, as I see life very much, as a place where you are very much in doubt, where you're just hanging around, and where the big dramatic clock is actually this thing about how do we use this time on Earth, before we fall into the grave, right? You can hear the clock out there, right? And for me, very often when I see films and I see this American dramatic drive, we have to be suspense, we have to be fear. Who is behind the door? Does he kill me or doesn't he kill me? It actually takes away the very dramatic thing, which is how do we use those moments on Earth before the big clock stops? Which I think is where the real drama is, right? And that's, of course, what I also do in this. So, to go back, I developed from the very beginning a thing I call stage documentarism. That means that I went out, did a lot of films in America and in Europe and in South Africa, where I lived for many years, where I actually go to some environment. I have a story in my mind before I find the location. Then I want to tell a story, for example, how can people change when they're actually in their 50s and 60s? Of course, I went to South Africa because I knew that after Mandela came out, the whole society had to change. It was a very important story. And then I find some white guys there who has big problems changing, and I research them very, very well. And then in the very end, I actually write a script on their lives and they play themselves, because that gives me actually, one thing is that I can control the camera. I can use I can use the visual power of film, but also I can kind of what I call sneak behind the face of reality, because for me, reality has a mask to sneak behind the mask of reality. You have to find a way in behind that mask. So therefore, I always had this thing that if you want to say that documentary films has anything to do with truth, then you have to define truth in a way that doesn't, that also include lying, right? Because lying is lying or fantasy for me is totally necessity to use those tools in order to get to the full person.
Yeah, you put this beautiful sentence in the prologue of the film, which I will just read because I like it so much. Most of what follows is true, but reality and dreams are like conjoined twins. If one dies, both will perish. Yeah. So that sets the tone for the whole film, and yeah, it's fascinating. Dive into this little microcosmos. So your film is called Dreaming Arizona, and it has also kind of a twin for me. It's Arizona Dreaming, the Kusturica film, like from almost 40 years ago. What I am wondering is the Arizonan desert, the cacti, the landscapes, the heat, a landscape that is also naturally connected to hallucinating powers for you. Or, well, is that the place where truth and reality and dreams like naturally are happening at the same time?
Yeah, and then also, it's also like that kind of, it's a classic Western landscape, but it's also this kind of, it always reminds me to a certain degree about the bone structure of humanity or something like that. It's both the beginning of life and it's the end of life, if you understand. It's like, it's not that middle period where we have neat small gardens and nice furnitures, to kind of hide away the brutality of time passing. It's just a naked stage, which to a certain degree, for me, you have to fill up with your own fantasies, fill it up with your own life, your own dreams, your own fears and stuff like that. So it's that kind of landscape. If you go through all my films, even my Danish films, all my Danish films are never shot in Copenhagen or any places like that. They're shot on the West Coast, where you have the same kind of totally open landscape, where all the houses, they're not placed neatly next to a little lake or something like that, behind some beautiful trees. They're kind of dropped like a kid who has been running through the landscape with some small wooden houses in his or her pockets, and they're kind of dropped out just by random and lying for no obvious reason in that landscape. And I think that, for me, is a very poetic way of describing how life is a coincidence. Why am I born Danish? Why do I have those parents? And why did I get those scars or those joys? Why wasn't I born under totally different conditions? This kind of the total randomness of life, and of course also the other side of that. And therefore, for me, that kind of landscape has always been very inviting for my filmic style.
So the group we are following of the high school, they are racially mixed, and Winslow itself is kind of an exception, I guess, as a little town in the Navajo reservation or Navajo County. It's a white-dominated town. How did you experience the demographic structure of Winslow? And maybe also, how did you feel the influence of the demographic origin of the people?
Yeah, but now, of course, in the film you have two girls Amber and Tristan coming from the Navajo reservation, and then you have two white girls coming from the Winslow, and you have a white boy coming from Winslow. And the film doesn't deal with issues about, you know, white exploitation of the Navajo areas, and of course one can say, how come the Navajo people live in something that they call the reservation, and the white guys, the newcomers, they live outside the reservation. It should be the other way around, right? But if there should be anything like that. But what I, you know, of course, at the very beginning, it's kind of a simplistic story. It tells some 5 different characters, and that was also a big challenge for me, because it's actually very hard to have 5 main characters. For me, it was hard. I never had so many main characters. And how do we develop them all sufficiently for people to engage in their minds and their dreams and fears? And, you know, it's just, I thought, you know, for me, it was the stage. I was fascinated by this little kind of, that kind of town that you only stop in if you, as a stranger, you know, you go on the highway. You only go in there if you have to go to the toilet, or you are desperately for food, because you know the food will be lousy in there, right? But there's not a lot of reason to stop there, right? And that gives a whole atmosphere to the. I did another little film there before this one called The Banality of Grief, which is a little story about the death of my wife, and which actually uses this film as a background. And the reason I went in there the very first time was this thing that. You go off the highway, as I did actually, and you get in there, and suddenly you realize that this place it's the center, you know, like my little place here, you see out here, the Danish village I grew up in, is the center of my universe, you know, that's all my calibrations come from here. That goes for that little village too. And then also there's a certain wisdom in that, in a place like that, because they know that they'll live on the periphery, while you guys in Munich and in New York and in Copenhagen, we have this kind of totally stupid idea that we live in the center of something, right? And to a certain degree, in my mind, we are much more stupid than those guys, because they know that we all live on this planet, we all live on the periphery of something we don't really know what it is, right? And that's much more obvious, those small places. When I'm in Copenhagen, I can forget about it. When I'm in Los Angeles, I can forget. I feel that, oh my God, here it's happening. After a year, I suddenly say to myself, what's actually happened during that year? And I went to like 100 cocktail parties and had a lot of stupid conversations, but very little time to actually think about some essential, right? And for me, it's much easier to work place I think there's certain wisdom in the periphery, in small places. And then, of course, the surrounding the Navajo reservation was tremendously. I think that there's a power in that landscape. And then, of course, it uses that little. There's a little political aspect in the way that we uses that. In '89, when the wall was collapsed in Berlin, you know, all those uranium mines that they had in the Navajo area that they used for their atomic bombs, you know, to keep up the Cold War. That was actually digged in those areas, and suddenly, you know, they couldn't sell the uranium anymore, and all those white owners that just left the place with the places open. And you know, when in the old days, all the people who worked there was native people, right? And they were not at all informed about that this was dangerous. They even took, you know, showers in contaminated water, you know, before they went back home to their family and stuff like that. And the death rate with cancer there is tremendously high, right?
Yeah, I have to interrupt you. I'm sorry. We have a film in our festival program which tells exactly about this story in the Navajo Nation. It's a fantastic film called Demon Mineral, and it had his world premiere at Dogfest.
Okay, I will look that up.
Yeah. Go on, just sorry for interrupting you. Just had to take the chance.
But there was something about this, as you know, this beautiful landscape. The kind of it's like the birth of this planet, and then at the same time you have this injection of total brutal, mean humanity in the middle of, you know, that there are like 150 mines like that just left, right? And so much misery has it created. And I thought the arrogance of just leaving it open, you know, was totally mind-blowing, right? But otherwise, you know, it's of course there was a little bit. None of the white people in the film that are in the high school, they were very good in relationships with natives, but they never went to the reservation, which I was a little surprised about. But obviously there still are some kind of antagonistic feelings in between. You know, there was a very strange thing in the reservation until I think 5 years ago or 6 years ago. If a white guy went in and did some crime on the reservation, he couldn't be prosecuted by the native police, and which of course results in a lot of crimes, right? Yeah. I think it has been corrected now, but it just tells a little about the arrogance of the surrounding society, right? This idea that you know, there's a lot of native girls disappeared, you know, was raped, disappeared, and this film isn't about that. You know, this film is primarily about their also this, which I think is so very touching in the film, that all the characters have serious problems back home. They're afraid to leave. You know, their future is somehow obstructed by troubles back home. You know, like Amber, who has want to be a journalist, go to Los Angeles, become a journalist. You know, she's afraid to leave back home because her mother, who has a problem with booze, you know, might not be able to take care of the kids and stuff like that. And it's probably a very international thing, you know, that our kids' vision of the future is so troubled by our bad manners, right? As parents, as the older generation, right?
So we get to know, as you just mentioned, 5 young teenagers at a very crucial moment in their lives, just before their high school ends. And they open up, really, and they tell us about family traumas, they tell us about the struggles. As a filmmaker, how do you approach to young people to open up and to share their stories?
Well, I think that I do, like I've done all through my career in the almost like 50 films I've done, is that I don't come in with any preconceived ideas about what their lives are like, right? I come of course, it's a privilege to be a filmmaker in the way that you can approach another human being and really ask questions about how did you deal with being alive as compared to how I deal with being alive. But I think that you know, even though I come in there as they were just here in Copenhagen for the opening, right? So I did a little interview with them, and they talked about how did you feel when this strange, you know, elderly white guy suddenly pops up at the high school and starts to ask all those questions. And they all said that somehow, you know, they felt it was as a kind of, all my questions somehow gave them an alibi to open up about themselves, to think about themselves, to kind of, and Verfremdung somehow, you know, got a little away from themselves, and therefore they could see themselves, you know, distance creates clarity sometimes. And therefore they said, which I was very happy about, that they, in the process of making this film, they have to face themselves. They are the main material, right? But in the making of that, in replaying themselves, they suddenly get a chance to analyze themselves, to kind of look at themselves from out there, right? And therefore they felt that they kind of developed, that they kind of had a possibility to kind of grow. Which, as I did behind the camera, as we, the film crew, did, right? Because of course, it's you know, filmmaking. What is filmmaking? It's people being together in front of the camera, behind the camera, and if it's for me the right kind of filmmaking, then it's a mutual voyage, you know, into the unknown, right? And we will all get wiser somehow, by kind of, we reflect each other's lives, Of course, I go for elements in their life that I know from myself. I had a troublesome childhood as well. I was at an orphanage as a very little boy. Had some beautiful but very, very confused parents. So to a certain degree, I've see other my films. It's one of my the themes in my production is this thing that the kids, they know how dangerous it is not to love your parents. They know if you're not any longer able to love your mom or your dad, then you feel crippled. You feel that the very fundament of your life has been broken, like the roots of the tree is suffering, right? And therefore, of course, because it's in my life, I've been looking for it in front of the camera because I only feel qualified to tell stories that somehow connects to my own life, right? I cannot tell. I've never been into. For example, I've never been very interested in winners, like kind of very kind of successful people because, they're not really in my backyard. I'm always interested in those doubters, those people who kind of really kind of feel, can I do it? Can't I do it? Will it? That's like all those kids. If I go for that dream, will I somehow make it? Will I be able, or am I strong enough to kind of get out of the darkness I might have been part of my childhood, right? And I think that in that way, I think it's a very eternal story because that's most of us have that kind of element in our lives, right?
How were your talks with the protagonists? Did the filmmaking, the creation of the film, the mutual creation of the film, as you mentioned, help them somehow coming out of their struggles a bit they have at home, like a growing, yeah.
Yeah, I just talked about this thing that they both, when I talked to her, we've been on Zoom constantly, saw the final film, and we didn't have the money to bring all of them over. We brought 2 of them over, and they were beautiful at the Q&As, in kind of explaining how dealing with this film, being in this film, having the possibility to go out of their everyday life and kind of see it as professionals with a professional eye, and now we have to turn this into a scene, the whole algebra of filmmaking, right? That how this Verfremdungseffekt, to use a German word, how that actually helped them to kind of get to grips with the elements in their life which had been so close to them, so they couldn't focus on them, right? By help of the filmmaking and the process of filmmaking, they kind of got a chance to focus on their own lives. And then another good thing about it, which I experienced with this style, with all my documentary characters playing their parts for me, is that this thing that you shoot out of continuity, that you actually suddenly you shoot, because we always shoot on a very low budget, so if we have light in one room, put light in, it takes a lot of time, then we shoot all the scenes from the whole script like in a feature film, right? And therefore suddenly everything is out of continuity. And that to a certain degree gives them a feeling of freedom as well, because suddenly this thing about you go and open that door and then there's the other room, always it's the same thing. Suddenly everything doesn't connect. It's like a jigsaw puzzle thrown out in the room and suddenly new possibilities opens up, right?
Yeah.
That's a very productive and positive element about filmmaking and dealing with your own life, right?
So for the teenagers, at the end of the film ends also their high school career, and they diffuse. I think they might leave Winslow at some point. Do you have still contact with them? Do you speak with them? What are their thoughts concerning the future?
Yeah, like Mackenzie, who is kind of somehow the leader on the stage. Mackenzie, the white girl, Mackenzie. She's actually in New York, upstate New York, studying drama, right? And Amber, she's in Colorado studying journalism. So she actually got away from from the reservation. She's going to return to the reservation because she loved her life on the reservation, but she has gone away to kind of fulfill her educational dreams, right? Kirsten, the other Native American girl, she's in Atlanta studying psychology, and Bryson, the boy, he has been married, got a child very young, and now he's just working to feed his family, right? But he's doing okay. And Sydney, she's studying the white girl, she's studying history. So pretty much they're up there and moving, right?
Yeah. So you have made so many films in your career already. You might know so many protagonists. You might have known so many protagonists. Are you used to stay in contact like forever, or is it at some point you, yeah?
No,
you
I don't. Of course, I've been thinking about this thing that I would be after when you have done film. I did my first film when I was in '72, right? So I've done film for 50 years actually. This year, right? Of course, sometimes you think about it would be fantastic to go back and find all those protagonists and see where they are now if they're still alive, right? Because suddenly you would have a magnificent material from back then and could make some new, and you could tell the long stretch of life stories. Some of them I've been in contact with for many, many years, but some of them, of course, things changes. But mainly I'll say that, of course, I'm not a journalist, so I never experienced this thing that you go out and you kind of squeeze something out of a character to get some information, to get a scoop or something like that. I go out and we create something together. So that, of course, is a much more nice situation to be in. I'm not there to exploit their life. I'm there that we together made some kind of painting of the life and the time and the life we live in, right? I haven't had any kind of I don't have any kind of serious problems. I have also in this film. I have Sydney. There's a scene in which is not the film where I asked Sydney to small stuff like her father was driving all the trains, and I wanted to make a scene where she kind of went down to the train and kind of waved to her. She was missing that father, and she was kind of screaming for her father, saying "Hello, Dad" or something like when he was passing. And in the middle of the shot, she suddenly said, "I don't feel like doing this, John," right? And of course, I accept that she doesn't feel like doing it, right? So we cancel the shot, right? And of course, that's a tremendous help for me because when you work, I've done quite a lot of feature films as well. The problem with actors sometimes, when you sit in the editing room afterwards, that is that they're actually so well paid, so they do what you say, right? Because suddenly you figure out, I write the scripts myself, that actually this is a fucking bad line or a disgusting scene you have made there, right? But they just do it, right? Those guys that are, we pay them, but very little, right? Because we don't have the budget to pay them. And they will, it's their own lives, so they will say, I don't want to do it, right? So you kind of have an extra check that helps you not to make too many errors, right?
Yeah, that brings us already to the next projects that you are working on or might be working on. Dreaming Arizona is still running on festivals internationally, but are you working for one project or more projects all at once? Are you filming at the moment?
Right now I'm working on two projects. Mostly I'm working on a feature film with a production company called Zentropa, you might know, in Denmark. Zentropa, a rather big production company. And I wrote an opera. It's an opera for pigs. For industrialized pigs. It's a love story actually there's a German element. It's a love story between an industrial Danish pig and a German wild boar from a big forest in the north of Germany, right? A lot of Danish pigs are taken to Germany to be slaughtered, right? So, of course you have suddenly one of those frogs, has a problem and this pig that disappears into the forest by a cat. But it's a very dramatic story. That's a feature film, and then it's an opera as an opera. But then I have another film which is raw documentary story, which is a story about, you know, my war was the Vietnam War. I grew up during the Vietnam War. I felt as a Danish, coming from a little country like Denmark, you don't have that problem in Germany. You have other problems. Denmark was kind of a museum. Sometimes as a young man, you felt like a museum. You lived in a museum. You were not touched, you know. After I grew up 5 years after the Second World War, I never heard about the Second World War, even though you could smell the chimneys coming to Denmark, right? But I never heard about it because we turned towards England and all that kind of, and all our cultures connection suddenly was with England and America. Before they were very much my parents' generation. They were all fluent in German, right? And I grew up with German music. My mother was an opera lover, right? But therefore, this, you know, my first war where I felt this detachment from reality was the Vietnam War, you know, because all my generations, they were going to Vietnam, and somehow what, you know, the badness they did was also connected to the richness, you know, the kind of material richness that I grew up with, right? And but I felt like kind of, how come, you know, you feel a little detached, like you were in a cute little museum and you could look down to Germany that was kind of building up again and stuff like that, and America who was out there conquering the world. But you were not conscripted to go and fight. You were not conscripted to fighting, if you understand. You were in a museum, in a cute little museum. And but I always wanted to tell a story about those guys who went to Vietnam, because also now it's very interesting because they are my age, you know, they're old guys, right? And they went there as coming out of high school. Suddenly, you know, I have some characters already who came out of high school that didn't know anything about the world. You know, Americans don't know a lot about the world, right? Because they think they are the world, right? They're put into, you know, have a little military training, put into this huge thing that take them down to a jungle, and then they're thrown into a jungle and say, shoot, shoot, shoot. And they never see the enemy. They only see the corpses of the enemy, right? And that terror they witness and they do down there kind of follow them their whole life, right? It's very hard for them to get back into, you know, the wonderful American way of life, you know, enjoying the suburbs and all that things, you know, that we're supposed to do. And then they kind of are tormented by that experience in their very fragile youth. And now they're standing in front of the big deaths. We're all standing in front, right? And I think this is a very dramatic moment in that generation's life. And I'm doing a story that takes place in America, of course, and in Vietnam, where I follow some of those characters. Because some of those characters, they actually, in the old days, you know, they went back to, like nearly Freudian, they went back to where it all happened and found peace in Vietnam and actually live in Vietnam now, right? So that's the projects I'm working on.
So good luck. All the best for your projects. We will definitely watch out for all that's coming up from you. Thank you so much for joining us via Zoom in our doc studio here at Deutsches Theater München.
Okay.
And I have to mention that your film is still nominated for the Kino Audience Award, donated by the BR and Dreisat broadcasters here in Munich. So our viewers and podcasters are able to vote for the film. Good luck for Dreaming Arizona, and see you next festivals, hopefully.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.